Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our playthrough of the Last Blitzkrieg campaign scenario. Today, the game gets going in earnest as we're going to start off with turn one. We will get the start of the turn taken care of and then dive right into the first German activation. So without wasting any more time, let's get right to it. Now, the first thing we do in a turn is the weather determination. For December 16th and 17th, as you can see here on the chart, the ground is going to automatically be normal. And in Last Blitzkrieg, you determine the ground state first, and then the atmosphere, and then the visibility, which is a little backwards, but it makes the effects work out properly. So we've determined we have normal ground state. Next, we'll determine the atmosphere. We're going to be rolling on the normal line here to see what kind of atmosphere we have. We rolled a 1, which is going to be a fair atmosphere. And then that's going to determine visibility. Again, we're rolling on the middle row of the visibility and get another 1. So we have so good visibility, fair skies. Not exactly how the historical campaign kicked off, but next we're going to have to roll for air points and replacements. There are no replacements rolled for on the first turn of any scenario because they are built into the setups, but we do have to roll for the Allied air points, and because we have a fair atmosphere, there is going to be some U.S. air points. They're going to get 4 air points to use throughout this first turn, which is a little bonus. Normally, as you can see, historically it was a poor atmosphere and they would have required a 6 to get any air points. So we'll see if the Americans can put those 4 air points to good use. Now, after the weather and air points and replacements, we're going to prepare our reinforcements. The Germans will receive a few more units from Kampfgruppe Piper and 1st SS Division, as well as the 150th Panzer Brigade, while the Americans will get the CCB of the 9th Armored Division. So I'll go ahead and get those prepared and set those off to the side. They will enter when their respective formations activate. So once I get those set up and ready to go, we'll pick back up with the first German activation. Normally, there is an assignments phase immediately following the replacements and reinforcements. However, on the first turn of any scenario, there is no assignments phase, so we're skipping that and going straight to the activations, the first of which belongs to the Germans. And we are immediately faced with one of the most important questions that you're going to have to answer in any BCS game, and that is, which formation do I activate next? Usually there are 4 or 5 things that need to be done right now. And unfortunately, you're only going to be able to address one of those before your opponent gets an opportunity to react. So prioritizing your opportunities as well as your impending disasters is a critical skill for being successful in the BCS. And when we look at the Germans here, they do have most, if not all, of the advantages at the beginning of the game. They certainly have the advantage in numbers. The American deployment has some weaknesses, and the Germans need to make sure that they maximize their advantages here on the first couple of turns. And in trying to do that, the sequence of which formations get activated becomes very important. So looking at the southern sector of the German line, you'll see the American 28th Infantry Division, the 3 regiments, regimental formations that comprise that division that cover most of the southern sector here are done. So we know that they're not going to be able to do anything the entire first turn. In fact, the American ability to react in the southern half of the front here is very limited on the first turn. Only the CCA of the 9th Armored Division and 4th Infantry Division, which are way down here on the very southern flank, as well as CCR, which is kind of tiny right here. Those are the only formations that will be able to try at least to do something on this first turn. So because of that, we can afford to wait at least a couple of activations before we get the southern half of our attack going. So we're going to shift our attention up to the northern half, and let's take a look there, because there are a few opportunities that the Germans are going to need to evaluate and decide how they want to kick off this attack. Now, looking westwards from the German lines up on the northern half, the American forces up here have a much better ability to respond, at least relatively compared to in the south. It's still not going to be all that great, due in part to the SNAFU modifier that the Americans are under for the first few days, as well as the fact that their formations are almost all used, which means that any activation they get would be a second activation. So there's a chance that, again, if they fail their activation roll, their second activation roll, they may not even get a shot on the SNAFU table to do anything. Now, the big exception to that here is the 106th Infantry Division, which is not used. There are three opportunities, at least at first here, for the Germans. Again, the overall plan, they need to clear some east-west roads. There's this main highway up here, the so-called northern route, as well as getting to St. Vith here. Now, St. Vith is the key, I'll say, intermediate objective for the Germans in this part of the battle. We'd like to take St. Vith by the second day, and then that gives us an opportunity to either exploit to the northwest, to the west, or down to the southwest. The U.S. forces present us with an opportunity up here. The bulk of 2nd Infantry Division, which is the clearly the best formation the U.S. has on this half of the front. The bulk of it is way up here, kind of in this northeast corner, with a single road basically up to where the fighting's going on. If we can punch a hole in the lines here and cut this road, it's going to take all of these battalions a lot longer to get back down where they can be of greater use to the Americans. And that's going to require the 277th Volksgrenadier piercing the 99th line and making it to the area of the Twin Villages here. Another opportunity we have is 14th Cavalry Group. It's a small unit, it's fairly spread out, and again, we've got 3 divisions roughly facing it. The issue with maybe going after the 14th Cavalry Group is that it is a rather small force. If we can push it out of the way or even destroy it, it may not be that big a loss to the Americans. Further south, however, we have the 106th Infantry Division. And again, the bulk of that is deployed in a very vulnerable position here on the Schnee Eifel, quite a ways from the headquarters back here in St. Vith, and with a very weakly protected flanks. As you can see, there's just a single squadron of the 14th Cavalry Group here at Roth, which is protecting this secondary road leading behind their front lines here. And I personally like to go after the 106th as quickly as possible, because when the Americans get a chance to activate, they are going to try to get these guys out of harm's way. And what we want to do is slam the trap shut on them before they get that opportunity. So in looking as to which formations to activate, we have the 18th Volksgrenadier deployed essentially opposite the 106, but they are overlapping both flanks here of the Schnee Eifel position. And if we activate this formation first, the plan would be then to just swing in on both flanks and trap these 2 regiments here, which will eliminate, hopefully, the bulk of this division, and it'll really open up the drive to get to St. Vith. So with that in mind, we are going to have our first activation with the 18th Volksgrenadier unit. And let's take a look at what that activation looks like. Having selected the 18th Volksgrenadier to take the first activation, we've flipped over the headquarters unit to the used side, and that brings us to the preparation step of each activation. Now, first thing we're going to do is check and make sure the trains are on the map, which they are here near Prüm. Then we need to check and see if the MSR is complete, the main supply route. Now, the main supply route for every formation runs from the headquarters along either a trail, secondary road, or primary road back to its combat trains marker, and then from there it must be along either a primary road or a secondary road all the way back to the friendly map edge, which for the Germans is the east edge. So having checked that, we have a complete MSR, so we don't have to mess with that any further. Next, we need to declare if the unit is going to enter, maintain, or drop any prepared defense status. Since we're on the attack, no prepared defense for the 18th Volksgrenadier. Finally, we need to check and see if it's mixed with any other formations, and that involves looking at its simple blob, as it is described in the rulebook. And basically, it's kind of the area of operations where the formation is. You only need to check the combat units and the headquarters. You don't have to worry about including the combat trains or any units that are currently out of command radius. And looking at the 18th Volksgrenadier, you can see here in the north, they are right up against the 3rd Fallschirmjäger, but I wouldn't consider this mixed, so they will not be marked with a coordination marker. And this isn't a recovery activation. So that brings us to the end of the preparation step. Now for the what's always the most important single roll for any formation, and that's the SNAFU roll. Since this is the first activation and the first SNAFU roll, I'm going to go ahead and show you the SNAFU table. We'll take a look at that, and I can run down all the modifiers. So you have, for those of you unfamiliar with BCS, you've got kind of an idea of what affects the SNAFU roll and how that works. Now for this portion of the activation, we're going to be looking at these two boxes on the game charts. The SNAFU table here, and then the list of modifiers to the left. Now the SNAFU roll is going to determine whether this activation is going to be a full activation, a partial activation, or a fail. And it may sound a bit random to you with a dice roll determining whether or not your formation even gets to do anything this particular turn, but as you'll see in the modifiers, it's not necessarily as random as you might think. Applying the modifiers, first thing we're going to look at is, does the formation have a fresh fatigue level? And yes, they do. So they're going to get a +1 for being fresh. There is no coordination marker on there. Their fatigue level is fresh, so we won't subtract anything for fatigue. They are not mixed. And then we come to game specific. And in this scenario, the Germans, all German formations, will have a +1 SNAFU die roll modifier for the 16th, 17th, and 18th of December, so the first 3 game turns. So that brings us to +2 so far. Now, we've got the next 2 sections. Either the main supply route is complete or it is not complete. In our case, it is complete, so we're going to ignore the bottom section here and only run through these modifiers to see if any of them apply. Optimal distance. You'll want your combat train marker to be located between 5 and 15 hexes from the formation's headquarters unit in order to be considered at optimal distance. Our combat trains are currently 5 hexes from the headquarters, so the optimal distance applies, giving us a +3. Ghost trains, the trains are not in their ghost trains mode, so that does not apply. We are, however, crossing the streams, and we'll take a look at this real quick once we head back to the map. So we are going to unfortunately suffer a -1 for that, which drops us to +2 so far. And then if MSR uses tracks and we have good trafficability or poor trafficability, you'll see too, when we take a look at the map, that from the headquarters to the combat trains, it's being traced over tracks. So there is good trafficability because we have normal ground conditions, which will apply another -1. So we have a net +1 to our SNAFU roll. So on a 6 or higher, we will receive a full activation, and we have no chance of a failure. So let's see what happens here with this first SNAFU roll. And they roll a 7, +1 is an 8. That's going to be a full activation, which is what we are looking for. The Germans are going to want as many full activations early on as they can get. Let's get back to the map and see what that means for the 18th Volksgrenadier. Back on the map here, you can see the headquarters for the 18th Volksgrenadier is located here in this rough terrain along a track. And because it uses a few hexes of track before reaching the secondary road, that's going to incur that -1 modifier for the SNAFU roll. The combat trains themselves are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hexes from the headquarters, which is the minimum distance to be considered optimal distance to get that +1. And keep in mind that you must use the shortest available distance between the HQ and the combat train. So we could not choose to trace it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hexes. We would have to go the shortest route from the HQ to the combat train. Now, the combat trains for the 18th are also stacked with the combat trains for the 62nd Volksgrenadier. And these two markers, along with the two headquarters markers for each formation, represent the hundreds and thousands of vehicles that are required to keep all the combat units in supply. And although there are just two rather innocuous looking markers here stacked together, what this really kind of in your mind's eye, you can picture just a giant traffic jam as two massive columns are trying to squeeze across the bridge here and wind their way through the town of Prüm as they continue their way forward. In BCS, the part of the main supply route between the headquarters and the combat trains is what really matters when it comes to crossing the streams. And if that path shares even just one hex with the MSR of another formation, you're going to end up crossing the streams, and both formations are going to suffer that modifier. Again, that's representing basically traffic jams in the rear behind the fighting elements. And what I like about BCS is that rather than just use some special rule that perhaps limits the German movement capabilities or something like that for the first few turns of a game like this, it really puts the management of the logistical tail of each of your formations into your hands. It's under your control. You make the decision about where you're going to place your headquarters unit and where you're going to place the combat trains in relation to that headquarters. And you've also got to keep in mind what effect the location you place these two units is going to have on neighboring formations. So in order to eliminate that crossing the streams modifier, I'm going to have to move at least one of the combat trains markers out of this hex and place it in another legal hex. When I do that and which formation I decide to move, that is part of the decision-making process that you're going to find in BCS. And again, it's another one of the little puzzly things that I really think make this system stand out among a lot of other operational level games. So, having discussed that, we did get a full activation thanks to the 8 that we rolled. And we now need to take a look at where we're going to place our objective markers. As part of a full activation, what that means is every unit will be able to use its full movement allowance. We're going to get 2 objective markers to place, and the artillery points assigned to the formation will not be halved as they would be under a partial activation. And you can see from the headquarters unit here that there are 3 organic artillery points assigned to the 18th Volksgrenadier, and it also has an additional 2 artillery points assigned to it, which gives it a total of 5 artillery points that it can use in this activation. I like to use a little countdown die or dice during the activation just to track artillery points as I use them, because you'll be using one here, a couple there as you go, and I find this just works real well for me as far as keeping track of those. So with that said, let's take a look and see what we want to do with our 2 objective markers. Now, placing your objective markers is another important decision that you're going to have to make each activation. That's because these objective markers, when placed, they create an objective zone that's going to extend out 2 hexes in every direction from the objective marker. And all of your attacks must occur within one of your objective zones for that formation, for that activation. So you really need to be thinking about what it is exactly you want to accomplish this activation with that unit, and that's going to determine where you're going to place your objective markers. Now, the game provides objective markers like that, although I prefer using these KTX markers just because they tend to not obscure the underlying units as much as these markers. So you probably won't see any more of these objective markers for the rest of this playthrough, and instead we'll use these KTX markers. Now with the 18th Volksgrenadier, what we want to do is we're trying to trap the 106th here in the Schnee Eifel. And for this activation, we're going to focus on basically caving in this left flank of the 106th and getting access to this secondary road here so that we can slide in behind the front line here and hopefully trap these guys, get them isolated, and eventually have them surrender. So with that in mind, we're going to place one of our objective markers right on top of this 14th Cavalry squadron that is in the village of Roth. And the question now is, what do we want to do with our second objective marker? The 2 hex objective zone here extends out, and it doesn't quite reach the battalions here on the Schnee Eifel. Neither does it reach really any of the other units. So if we want to actually try to attack or barrage any of these units along here, we're going to have to place the second objective marker somewhere else. However, if we place both objective markers in the same hex, we will get a +1 die roll modifier to any engagements or any combats that take place within that objective zone. That's known as a double tap in the BCS lingo. So while it's tempting to try and strike as many of these guys as we can, I think right now the important thing that we want to do is make sure that we're able to win this fight right here against this small cavalry unit and open up the door to allow us to swing in behind them. So we're going to place both of our objective markers right there on Roth. Now, it's important to note that an objective marker must be placed on an enemy unit or on a victory hex location. So we could not simply place the objective markers here in this empty hex. And so that's why we're placing them both right on top of the cavalry unit there. Now with the objective markers placed, we're free to go ahead and begin moving and fighting with all of our units in the formation. And the first thing we're going to want to do, obviously, is hopefully blast a hole here and then come pouring through. And to open up this gap here, I think what we're going to do is rely on this, it's a Voraus unit. It's a kind of a mixed unit that was formed, an ad hoc unit within the division here with some, I think this is primarily maybe some heavy armored cars. There may be some assault guns in here, but this unit will have the ability to run up and do an engagement and hopefully drive off or kill the American armored cars there. Now that the objective markers have been placed, we can go ahead and move and fight with all of our units in any order we desire. And I've chosen a fairly conservative plan that's going to maximize our chances of moving this guy out of the way. Preferably we'll destroy him, but as long as we can shove him out of the way and open up this left flank of the 106th, that will satisfy us. Ideally, we'll get to the point where we can trap all these guys right here on the ridge line. So we'll see how that unfolds. To start things off, we are going to move our Voraus unit up. He's going to go 1-2 for the tracks, and he will enter an AV zone of control from the American Armored Recon there. And because it is a real actual AV unit and it's not an AV ZOC from a support unit, I do have to do at least one required stopping engagement. And that's going to be AV of 2 plus 3 for the action rating unit gives us a 5. There are only 2 modifiers that apply to the firer on the engagement table, and that's double objective zone and limited AV. We do have the double objective zone. That's going to give us a +1 for a total of 6. Now the Americans have 1 AV plus 4 action rating for a total of 5. The prepared defense does not apply to them because they do not have a deployed side. They only have a move side. So they're not in prepared defense. They do not have multiple supports. Being a dual unit, they're not eligible for any actual support, and they're not a standoff support unit. So no modifiers for the Americans gives them a 5. 6 minus 5 is going to give the Germans a +1 DRM on the engagement table. We'll see how this stopping engagement goes. They rolled a 7. 7 plus 1 is an 8. Since the target is a real AV, that results in both loss. So the Cav is going to suffer 1 step loss, as is Kampfgruppe Ren. Now, that will also use up one of the fire events for the Voraus unit. That being the case, we will go ahead and take a second engagement with them to try to break it. Everything will remain the same, so it is once again a +1 for the Germans. The die roll is a 6, +1 is 7 for another both loss. That is going to eliminate the last step of the American recon unit, and it will apply a second step loss to the Germans. That will also, since that used their second fire event, that means that the Voraus unit is now stopped. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that real quick. Well, that was a little bit of a mixed success for the Germans. We did open up the hole we were looking for. However, it was a bit costly, as our Voraus unit took 2 steps in the 2-step losses, and are now down to only 2 remaining steps. They're also stopped here, and we were hoping they would get a chance to penetrate a little further. But that's okay. If we can get a second activation with the 18th Volksgrenadier, we should be able to accomplish our immediate objective this turn. So now it's pretty much up to the infantry. Now, keep in mind, the objective zone is 2 hexes out from here. There are no other American units in the objective zone, so the balance of this activation is going to be pretty much restricted to German movement. And I'll just go ahead and start in on that. Where do these guys go here? Let's see. 3, 4, we'll put him here. 1, 2, 3 there. I'm going to bring let's see. I'll have the Ost battalion here move up 2, 4 right in here. Place them there. 1, 2, 3. Now with BCS, units cannot move directly from one zone of control to another zone of control. So what we're attempting to do here with the German infantry battalions is essentially lock these guys, these Americans, into place and have them preferably isolated and cut off. It's not going to be a completely watertight seal at the end of this first activation. There'll be a little gap out here, but the idea is to put the Americans in a zone of control where they currently are, and then surround them with zones of control with some other units rushing in through the gap here, which will, again, kind of lock them in place. Let's see, he's there. We'll move the Ersatz battalion up here. What's that? 1, 2, 3. That won't quite get, like I said, won't quite get the western end here, but we have managed to trap at least this one regiment for now. I think that's going to do it for the movement, and actually for the pretty much for the activation, first activation. One thing we have to keep in mind is everybody must end their movement in the command radius. It is 8 hexes for 18th Volksgrenadier, and command radius is strictly a hex radius. Enemy units and zones of control don't matter. However, we also need our guys to have safe paths, and a safe path is a path that is traced free of enemy units and zones of control. The zones of control can be negated by friendly units, and it is a path that is the command radius plus 5 hexes. So this would be probably the only guy that might be in question. We can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. He's well within the safe path limit, so we don't have any issues there. Having completed our activities for the turn, we move on to the cleanup phase for the activation. This is where we would remove the objective markers, we would remove the stopped or traffic markers here. And what else do we have? Any temporary drop support markers would be removed. Combat trains, if they're not at optimal distance at this time, they would be flipped to the ghost side. And now we check fatigue, and the only thing, we placed objective markers, and we also did an engagement, both of which, well, the placing combat objectives would be a 1 to generate fatigue. However, the engagement is a 1 or 2. So we're going to roll 1 die, and if we roll a 3 or higher, we'll maintain our fresh status. We roll a 5, so 18th Volksgrenadier remains fresh, which is important because now we're going to attempt to gain a second activation, and the activation number, as you can see on the headquarters here, is a 4. Because we are fresh, we actually get a +1 to that die roll. So a 3 or better, and we will get that second activation. That's a 6. So we get the second activation, and now we basically go back to the beginning with the SNAFU roll. Now for this second activation SNAFU roll, nothing has changed. So we have the +3 or +1 for fresh, +1 for the optimal distance, +1 for the game-specific DRM, and then -1 for tracks and -1 for crossing the streams. So it's still a net +1. SNAFU roll comes back as a 9, which is going to be a full activation. And now the question is, do we bother placing objective markers? And I think we will. Because we're taking a second activation, we're going to have to make a fatigue roll that is a 1 or 2 anyway. So launching any barrages is not going to hurt us otherwise. And we do have our full artillery complement of 5 artillery points. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place the objective markers. I'm going to split them this time. I'm going to place 1 here and 1 here. And you'll see that what that will do is that will place all 5 of these American battalions within an objective zone, which will allow us to shoot at some or all of them. Now, what we want to do is close the trap on them. So we're going to start off by moving our Voraus unit here. And there is a special rule on the 16th of December. Any German unit that has a functional movement allowance of 12 or higher, you have to subtract 4 movement points from that. So because he's printed with a 12 here, he actually only has 8 that he can spend, but that will be enough for our purposes. He's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here. And what that will do is that will now create a zone of control. Basically, we've got these 5 battalions surrounded on the Schnee Eifel. And what we will do now is we've got 5 artillery points. We can spend 1 artillery point to barrage a hex or attack it by fire with our artillery if we do not launch an attack. You can spend up to 3 points on a hex, but only as part of an actual attack on the hex. I don't feel the need quite yet to do an actual attack that would give us a better chance of losing our fresh status with the fatigue roll. So I'll be content to just start shelling these troops to start to wear them down, and we'll let hopefully isolation and attrition start to take its toll. So what we'll do is, since we've got 5 artillery points and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, there are 5 American units here, we will just drop 1 artillery point on each hex. So we'll need to consult the attack by fire table, or the barrage table, and all of the units are in terrain, so I will need a 4 or higher to inflict a step loss on each of the battalions. And we'll work from left to right here. So the first shot is a 1, that's a miss. The second shot is a 5, that's 1 hit on the 1st Battalion of the 422nd. The next one on the 3rd Battalion is another 5, so that's another hit. And then on the last 2, we have a 6, which is a hit, and a 6. So the Germans were shooting pretty well today. That's all of their artillery, and they've inflicted 1 step loss on these 4 battalions, but they missed the guys on the end here. That is, I think, pretty much it. I don't see anything else we necessarily want to do with any of the infantry units at this point in time. So we're going to move on to the cleanup phase. And again, we don't have, we take our objective markers off, and we have no traffic or temporary support dropped markers to remove. And it's on to the fatigue roll. Again, it's a 1 or a 2, both because of the second activation and because we did some barrage attacks. It is a 5, which means they still remain fresh, which is good news for the Germans. And that's going to do it for the first activation of the 18th Volksgrenadier. I would say that was a successful turn. They managed to accomplish their objective. They maintained their fresh fatigue. The only downside is the 2 step losses to their only armor unit in the formation. But they offset that by killing a Cav squadron, and they've inflicted some step losses here on the 106th Infantry Battalions, which means now it's going to switch over to the Americans, and the American will have a player will have a chance to activate one of his formations.